A popular question that people have been asking at least since the mid-60s of the Jesus movement, which has come to mind a number of times in the gospel readings over the last few weeks, is the question that people love to ask in any given ethical situation: what would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? And have you ever noticed, whenever people ask that question, that regardless of what the situation or the issue happens to be, the answer is always the same answer? One way or another, it's the same answer. Well, what do you know? He'd do exactly what I'd do. He'd say exactly what I'd say. Shazam! Basically, it's an example of how in our modern world today, religion for so many people, and perhaps all of us, one way or another, are guilty of this. Religion, in many ways, is reduced to only two things: wishful thinking and imaginary friends. Instead of allowing God to create us in His image, we instead paint God into our image, in which God is little more than an imaginary friend, no different than a 6-foot rabbit named Harvey, whose motto in existence is pretty much, "I will do anything for you." But as a priest preaching during the Mass here at the cathedral in San Francisco, let me categorically be very clear. And yes, I am saying this. I don't care what Jesus would say. I don't care what Jesus would do. I care what Jesus did say. And I care what Jesus actually did. And in today's gospel, we have an example, multiple examples, of how Jesus and what He did and what He said flies in the face of the popular presumptions of what people would think when they ask the question, what would Jesus say? What would Jesus do? We have the very well-known story of the rich man. In the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't say he's young. That is a feature mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, but it is nonetheless someone who is rich, who asks him, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, for most people, they would say, what would Jesus say? And would pretty much stick to, just be a good person. Whatever that means. But Jesus tells them, of course, follow the commandments, to which He says, I've done them since my youth. Now, if we were to go by the standards of today, what would Jesus say to the man who's followed the commandments? Most of us would presume He'd pat him on the head and say, oh, you're doing just fine. Just keep doing what you're doing and you'll make it. You're doing just fine. Don't worry about anything. No, that's not what Jesus would say, because we know what Jesus did say. And He said, you're lacking in one thing. And perhaps when it comes to the question of what would Jesus say, what would Jesus do, the best way to answer it for any of us is, what's the last thing we would want Jesus to say? What's the last thing we would want Jesus to do? Knowing He would never tell us to sin, knowing He would never condone the commission of sin, what is the last thing we would want or expect Jesus to say or do? For the rich man, we have the answer. Sell all you have and give to the poor. The last thing the rich man wanted to hear and expected to hear, and as a result, he walked away sad, for he had many possessions. So here's a man walking away unhappy. What would Jesus do in that situation? Well, He no doubt would say, oh, wait a minute, come back. Maybe I was a little over the top. It was a little too much. Maybe I should change that teaching so I won't lose so many people. After all, this is someone with money. He could be useful later on. No, that's not what Jesus would say, because we know what Jesus did say. He said, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for one who is wealthy to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, of course, that flabbergasted the apostles, because the presumption at the time was that if you were wealthy, you were blessed by God. To which they asked, then who can be saved? How would Jesus answer that question? Oh, you'll be saved just by being a good person. If we're good people, we'll be saved. So make sure each one of you is a good people, and you will be saved. So don't worry, God will find a way. No. Jesus simply answered in the last possible answer anyone would expect or anyone would want. For human beings, it's impossible. You can't do it. We can't do it on our own. But all things are possible with God. So now naturally Peter steps forward. Well, we, unlike the rich man, we've given up everything to follow you. What would Jesus say in response to Peter? He would say, oh, great, you've given up everything for me, you're on the right track, keep doing what you're doing and you're going to make it. No, that's not what Jesus would say, because we know what Jesus did say. Sounds good at the beginning, but what does he include at the end? You will receive 100 times more now, houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, and children and lands, with persecutions. This to this band of faceless cowards who not long afterwards would abandon Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane at the first sign of trouble. The last thing they wanted to hear is that they would be persecuted, hated, bullied, arrested for professing a faith in Jesus. Now we know the apostles eventually became the heroic teachers and apostles, the founding fathers of our faith that they became. For all we know, the rich man sold all he had and gave to the poor and followed Jesus. But nowhere in today's gospel do we hear appealing things that Jesus said. So obviously there's nothing wrong with asking the question, what would Jesus say? What would Jesus do? But perhaps the best way to answer that question, knowing that Jesus would never tell us to commit sin, would be to ask ourselves, what's the last thing we would want Jesus to say? What's the last thing we would want Jesus to do? Because we have that clue in the gospel reading all throughout the gospels. Jesus doesn't tell what people want to hear, but he gives us the truth, unapologetically, uncensored, unremitting truth. He doesn't deny that it is difficult to enter the kingdom of heaven, but calls on us to put our faith in God, not because God will take care of everything for us, but because God will give us the strength we need to do the difficult, to do what it takes to enter the kingdom of heaven, to do as Jesus did, to say as Jesus said, and most importantly, not to presume what Jesus would say or what Jesus would do. We don't have to ponder that really all that deeply because we know what Jesus did and we know what Jesus did say. But let us also focus on something else he said in today's gospel, that all things are possible with God, and put our faith and trust in God and the grace that he gives us, starting in the grace of this Eucharist and the graces he gives us in multiple different ways, sacramentally and otherwise, that he promised he would give us as his followers. But it's not a grace that makes things easier, and it's not a grace that leads to our own presumption that reduces God to an imaginary friend and our faith as nothing more than wishful thinking. But rather it's a grace that will help us to do the difficult, to hear what Jesus did say, to imitate what Jesus did, so that we can, like the man in today's gospel asked, we can be given the answers and given the strength to do what it takes to inherit eternal life.